And I just need to say to all of you, there are a couple things that I know about you. Some of you I know better than others. But some of you have walked away from things. Some of you have lost your pensions. Some of you have never had a pension. Some of you have had to work 2 and 3 jobs just to do ministry, and are. Some of you have been able to be engaged in a reality of church which meant giving it all up so that you could have what Christ had prepared for you. Now, you see, when I read the lives of the saints, that's what I'm reading about. So, thank you for being my heroes. It does not matter what the date was when this could have occurred. That's irrelevant now because we don't look back. What we do is we look forward, as I said last night. But in order to have an appropriate understanding, I believe, of ecclesiology, it does require of us that we look back to understand what we mean by a Catholic ecclesiology. That is to say, an ecclesiology that has some semblance of universality to it. Ecclesiology, by and large, has always had inherent in it a sense of communio sacris. That is to say, being in communion with someone, being in relationship with someone. Traditionally speaking, prior to the Great Schism, and by the way, that wasn't the 1976 General Convention. Prior to the Great Schism, we recognized that it meant being in communion with an historic see. The part of appropriate ecclesiology meant being in communion with an historic see. The notion of relative independence, of course, is a very modern point of view. That would mean that in communio sacris carried with it ambiguity. These ambiguities weren't always easily defined by virtue of the fact that they were ambiguities, of course, but it oftentimes involved the question of with whom am I in communion? For example, one may very well, in Eastern Europe, never have moved and been under several jurisdictions without ever having to go next door. Why? Well, your borders have changed. This year you're under the Pope and you used to be under the Patriarch. All one has to do is to walk around the landscape of this country and recognize that a number of the Eastern rites, for example, both in Orthodoxy and under the Patriarch of Rome, the Pope, have similar histories, similar hometowns, similar circumstances, but historically, depending upon what time that migration occurred, were either under the Patriarch of Constantinople or under the Pope. As you well know, if you would go to a Ruthenian liturgy, whether it be Byzantine Rite or whether it be OCA, you won't know the difference in the liturgy until you hear which bishop they pray for. This whole notion of being in communion with an historic see is the prevailing principle of ecclesiology. Now, when we get into trouble is when we have multiple occurrences of depositions and anathemas. Meaning that you may be in communion with this historic see, but did you know that he's a heretic and an apostate? However, as we look at, and forgive me, I'm a 7 ecumenical council kind of guy. As you look at the ecumenical councils, what you will recognize is that even in the midst of many of the anathemas, there was still the desire to be somehow in communio sacris. In other words, not to be in communion was not normative, it was extraordinary, and it was waiting for the opportunity when this reconnection would take place. And one of the anomalous things that we also have encountered is when we look carefully at the 39 articles, for example, and we recognize that the efficacy of the sacrament is not hindered by the nature of the celebrant, for example, we know that that is nothing other than a 16th century articulation of the councils that had to be articulated. Why was that? Because the question came up. I think I was baptized by an Arian. Am I baptized? Do I have to be rebaptized? And so we had to deal squarely with, from an ecclesiological perspective, what we meant by church, what we meant by being in communion. And so obviously it is only a relatively recent idea, and I say that in an advisement, but a relatively recent concept of sola scriptura. That is a relatively recent phenomenon. I'm not denying its validity. But what I'm trying to say is that the Holy Scriptures, as we read them from an ecclesiological perspective, have been done within the context of an ecclesiological framework. Hooker never said three-legged stool, and you know that. Only people who've read about Hooker are willing to say that. However, it would be true, in looking at even the articulations of Hooker, to be able to say that he recognizes the preeminence and significance of Holy Scripture and would not have succumbed to a modernist point of view, which would say something like, people wrote the Scriptures, therefore people can't change the Scriptures. I loved that at one general convention. It was a field day for ecclesiology in my mind, but the problem was a person there in the House of Bishops would have needed to know what ecclesiology is. So it meant getting to that remarkable set of circumstances of asking ourselves in ecclesiology, what is it that we mean by the role of Scripture? A great deal of church history, and thus ecclesiology, has been reactionary. That is to say, when we see an abuse, what you see is an opposite force, which is an attempt to over-accentuate the opposite. If there's been an abuse here, then we have to state something that will not only show how much an error this position is, but we want to go 10 extra miles on our point. And as we read Catholic ecclesiology, that is the beauty of having 2,000 years worth of it, we as Anglican Christians don't have to pick and choose. It's all ours. Not just one little moment in history. It's all ours. If you want to, as I said last night and suggested, say that your understanding of English church history begins with one of the 70, remember which one? Who winds up on the shores of England? All right. Name begins with an A. Check it out. That's one perspective to be able to go. One of the 70 actually made it there. Or, as I suggested, if you like the Glastonbury legend, you even like going to Glastonbury, and you want to see the bush that was thrust down, as the legend has it, by St. Joseph of Arimathea, great. I mean, wherever you are, what you have to admit is that there was an ecclesiastical reality with an ecclesiology which had in the very center of it Christ.